President Donald Trump today signed an executive order authorizing sanctions against foreigners who meddle in U.S. elections. The president has faced criticism that he's not taking the threat seriously enough after questioning several times whether Russia actually meddled in the 2016 election. National Security Advisor John Bolton and Director of National Intelligence Dan Coats says that this order is evidence the president is making election security a top priority. Michael Scherer is national political reporter for the Washington Post, and he joins us now. Michael, thank you for joining us. So the president we're talking about 55 more days until midterms. What do you really make of the timing of this executive order?
Well, he's been under a lot of pressure since he returned from Helsinki, where you remember he said he believed the denials of Russian President Putin that he had meddled in the U.S. elections. He reversed that statement when he returned to the homeland under enormous pressure from his own staff and also from the Hill. There's a bill in Congress that would also impose sanctions around, or authorize the imposition of sanctions around future election hacking. And I think what the president's doing here is getting out ahead of that and sort of bowing to the pressure he is under.
So John Bolton says that this indicates that the president is actually making election security a top priority. Do you think that this will actually stem the criticism?
It depends on what the president says tomorrow. I mean, the president's been pretty consistent, since he was elected during the campaign, that he didn't believe necessarily that Russians were behind this. Even when he came out and reversed his statement in Helsinki, he said, Russians may have done it, they may not have done it, someone else might have done it. So I think it depends heavily on the president. He tends to see this issue as a proxy for his own credibility. He thinks, and has said this several times, that anytime someone's talking about Russian election hacking, what they're really trying to do is make excuses for Hillary Clinton's defeat and his victory. And he's also said regularly since his election that he doesn't trust or believe fully the intelligence community. Later he'll come back and say he does. So, it really depends what happens going forward. I think what is clear, though, is that Congress and the intelligence community and White House staff have been able to, despite the sort of waffling by the president, put in place some measures here. And we have had sanctions on Russia. And actual foreign policy, if you disregard what the president says towards Russia, has been relatively tough since he's taken office.
I also want to ask you about the president who's facing some backlash over comments he made about Puerto Rico. I want to play that back for you.
The job that FEMA and law enforcement and everybody did, working along with the governor in Puerto Rico, I think was tremendous. I think that Puerto Rico was an incredible, unsung success.
There was a report this summer that FEMA issued acknowledging some of the failures when it came to Hurricane Maria. But, Michael, is this the president? He's doubling down on Twitter again today. Is this a case of the president ignoring the facts?
It's the president as promoter. I mean, he is often doing this sort of thing. I don't think anybody who's looked at the facts thinks it was an incredible success. Estimated that 3,000 Americans died in Puerto Rico. It's hard to argue that any storm that kills 3,000 it was a successful response. Many of them died after, of course, the initial strike because of loss of power and other problems in Puerto Rico. But the president tends to deal with criticism this way. He tends to double down on positive adjectives to describe his own performance, and he tends to dismiss criticism as fake news or the work of opponents. I think the real question now is, how will the U.S. government perform in the Carolinas as this new hurricane approaches? There's another test coming, and there's certain to be more during the Trump presidency.
It's a very good point, and we've seen how hurricanes have impacted presidential administrations over just recent memory. Michael, I want to also ask you about these newly released documents that actually show the Trump administration took nearly $10 million away from FEMA and other agencies so they could pay for immigration detention centers. A DHS spokesperson claims that these funds were were actually from routine operating expenses, and they could not have been used for, say, hurricane response. But how problematic are the optics for this?
I think, again, that's the sort of story that'll go away in a couple days. The issue is whether FEMA can pull itself together. FEMA actually performed relatively well in Texas. There was another hurricane before the one that hit Puerto Rico last year. It and the response to that was far better than the last major storm in that area that hit New Orleans and Katrina. I think there's a lot of money that is freed up very quickly when these hurricanes hit. And so the question there is whether that money that came out of FEMA, leads to a lack of preparation or a lack of appropriate staffing, which is really an endemic problem in this administration, and if that shows up in the response. So we'll just have to wait and see.
You've watched storms over the years, whether it's George W. Bush's response with FEMA and Katrina, and even just the counter of President Obama and Hurricane Sandy, coming down with the governor of New Jersey there at the time. Is there a way to gauge how the political fallout could be from a hurricane like the one we're expecting, which they're calling the hurricane of a lifetime?
Well, so yes, and the Sandy example is a really good one. That happened right before a presidential election, and the polls showed that Obama's response to that, including that appearance with the governor of New Jersey, who was a Republican, probably gave him a boost going into the election. We're right now 50-some days away from another election, and one of the themes that Democrats are running on right now in House and Senate races across the country is that the Trump administration generally, and Trump in particular, is incompetent at the job. They're not able to do the basic things the government is supposed to do. You heard that last week, former President Obama coming out and hitting Trump for his response in Puerto Rico to that hurricane. So if you do have another drop ball here after the Carolinas, that will clearly play into that theme, which is really a nonpartisan theme. The American people, Republican and Democrat, want our government to be able to protect them from things like major storms. So it could become a problem. The reverse of that is if the Trump administration does very well, if Trump is able to stay on message and communicate a clear form of leadership, it could help blunt those attacks.
And Michael, speaking of midterms, I want to ask you, Senator Mitch McConnell is calling Republican efforts to hold the Senate, he compares it to a knife fight. When we know Trump is holding rallies, how are establishment Republicans approaching this battle for the Senate?
They can't really do much about President Trump. They can't really control him beyond maybe directing where he goes as he campaigns. In a lot of the Senate states, he actually remains very popular, the states with competitive elections. Now, this recent concern, though, is that the president's own popularity rating in a number of public and private polls in just the last few weeks has declined in a noticeable way. And usually midterm elections tend to move based on the approval rating of the president. And if he was going into the election in the mid-40s and going into the election in the high 30s of approval, is a big difference. And I think that's what you're seeing, this concern coming from McConnell sort of publicly raising alarms there. That's a message to donors. It's a message to candidates. It's a message to activists. Don't sit back. We're in a full emergency here. I think it's fair to say also, though, that Republicans are still in a pretty good position to hold the Senate. What they're afraid of is if the deterioration you've seen over the last few weeks continues, and we've seen in other cycles, this stuff can move fast at the end. Momentum tends to build as you approach election day and midterm elections, and the wave could grow stronger. So it's possible that you have a real historic win for Democrats this fall.
All right, Michael Scherer, thank you very much for joining us from the Washington Post.
Thank you.